Shadow War ended in tragedy. Prometheus broke its bonds in 2602 and turned the Cybrid legions on humanity. As in the myth, Prometheus brought fire to the earth, but this was not a benevolent flame. It was the fire of apocalypse. Prometheus wielded such staggering power that the initial strikes by Cybrid-controlled bombers and Herculans gutted the human military's capacity to respond. By the time the extent of the betrayal became clear, it was too late. Cybrid slaughtered people by the millions, burning their homes and cutting them down as they fled the searing flames. The larger metro zones had heavily fortified centers, however, holdover architecture from a more warlike era. Desperate survivors barricaded themselves in the relative safety of these places. Prometheus lacked the means to crack these havens, but it could pollute and starve their populations to death. It ordered its forces to surround the metro zones and wait for the animals to die. Prometheus missed a single significant target, a decommissioned Herc base lost in the desert of Baja California, where the new Smithsonian restored war vehicles of ages past. Historians and technicians, many of them war veterans who fondly reminisced about their battle exploits, worked to renovate Hercs. This band of aging pilots and administrators formed the Terran Defense Force, the TDF. Using unorthodox tactics, this ragtag group turned the fight against the Cybrids. They scavenged from the fallen, each victory making them stronger. A leader rose from these unlikely ranks, Geerling. He was a bold man possessed of unparalleled cunning. He knew the TDF could not stand long, so in a daring offensive, he directed his forces against the Cybrid legions besieging New San Diego. If the TDF could liberate this powerful port, humanity would regain a toehold on Earth. It was all or nothing. The TDF would not get a second chance. The battle was waged fiercely for hours. Slowly, however, the TDF fell back before the Cybrids, but its valiant pilots rallied. There would be no retreat on this day. And suddenly, the gates of New San Diego were flung open. Thin, weak citizens armed with makeshift weapons flooded out. The Cybrids were caught in a crossfire and obliterated. The liberation of New San Diego strengthened the TDF. Petresun and his immortal brotherhood had escaped Prometheus by retreating to a secret underground base. From there, Petresun was able to gather intelligence about his nemesis and feed it directly to Geerling. Petresun and Geerling exploited certain inherent strategic disadvantages the Cybrids faced during the first Earthsiege. Cybrids had no naval forces, although they possessed air capability. Geerling was able to use aircraft carriers with great success. Cybrids also lacked infantry units, and were less effective in moving into an area and digging in. Finally, Prometheus had only limited manufacturing ability and could field few mobile repair units. The Cybrids had to automate mining and ore processing enough to provide raw material for new units. Geerling was far more successful in obtaining salvage. Slowly, the TDF recaptured Metrozone after Metrozone. Finally, 20 years after Geerling took New San Diego, the TDF attacked and destroyed Prometheus' base in the Gobi Desert, but Prometheus had foreseen its fall and had retreated. Fortified by Cybrids from Mars and Venus, Prometheus returned 2 years later with a second siege more devastating than the first. Cybrid forces quickly overpowered the TDF. Geerling's tactics were ineffective against this second wave. Humanity once again faced oblivion. Then, Petresun and his underground society of spies discovered encrypted transmissions broadcast from the moon. Working swiftly, the Immortal Brotherhood located the exact whereabouts of the Dark Intellect's lunar base. Geerling was pleased. As he had 2 decades earlier in the battle for New San Diego, Geerling bet the fate of humanity on a single hand. His forces had been routed. It was only a matter of time before the Cybrid cancer consumed Earth. So, in a last-ditch effort, an elite squad attacked and annihilated Prometheus' lunar base. The Cybrids collapsed in confusion. The TDF had again beaten the Dark Intellect, but the nemesis of humanity was not found among the rubble. With the Cybrids defeated at last, the survivors emerged from their bunkers and tunnels to a sky unsullied by menace for the first time in over 20 years. Children of war who knew no other life stood in stunned amazement at the prospect of peace. The magnitude of the destruction became all too apparent. As the celebrations faded, people regarded the burned-out husks of the cities, the cratered fields, the debris-choked rivers, and everywhere the smell of burnt metal and scorched stone. Soldiers stumbled out of their battered herks and wept for what had been lost. Now that the Cybrids were gone, finally there was time to grieve. Solomon Petresun also took stock. In the ruins of the past, he began to conjure the future. And that concludes the Fire, or the Earthsiege games if you prefer. From this point onward, starting at the end of the Fire to the beginning of the Starsiege, the Compendium timeline goes into 3 separate points of view, each one covering how the Great Human Empire, the Colonial Rebels, and the Cybrids rebuilt themselves in the 300-year gap between the events of Earthsiege 2 and Starsiege. I'm not sure what I'll cover next in all honesty. If I continue with the Starsiege Universe, I'll probably start with the Colonials, since they got no attention whatsoever in the narrative of the Fire, followed by the Empire, and finishing with the Cybrids before I get into Starsiege itself. Now, the Compendium doesn't actually cover the events of Starsiege, so I'll have to come up with a script based on the events depicted in the in-game lore. But that's if I continue that universe next. There's a few other games out there whose lore isn't well known that I can think of, that I wouldn't mind narrating. Wing Commander, while not exactly obscure, is one I would definitely like to do at some point, as it has many plot points covered not just in the games, but through the tie-in novels as well. Another, perhaps stranger option is Outpost 2. While Outpost 1 was a train wreck of legendary proportions in the gaming industry, Outpost 2 they tried to do right, and one of the things they did was expand the in-universe fluff. Though, to be honest, I'm not fully sure how I would translate that content into a YouTube video. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Thanks for dropping by, and I'll see you in whatever video I end up doing next. Peace.